Hello, I'm Robert. I'm fact checking to help you if you're scared of many things. And this is about people who are scared that Russia might attack us with nukes. And the, one way to think about this is to try and think about it the other way around. So, do you think it would make sense for NATO to attack Russia with nukes? And I'm sure you immediately say, no, of course not. That makes no sense at all. And so why would it make sense then for Russia to attack us? For them? How could that possibly make sense for them? If you flip it around, if you were in Russia and you're a Russian and you're looking at NATO, how could it make sense for your government to attack us with nukes? I think the answer is it doesn't. So anyway, I'm going to go into this a little bit more detail. First of all, a lot of people don't seem to realise quite how superior NATO is to Russia. These are just various components of the NATO, and you can see this NATO, and that's compared to the red is Russia. You can see in all of them, it's only really on artillery, which isn't listed there, that Russia is roughly comparable to NATO. And if you look at the jet fighters, then NATO is vastly superior to Russia, because it's more like 300 for the United States and a few dozen for NATO. I don't know how many of these F-35s, and only a dozen of them for Russia. And you can forget about all the other planes once these enter the battle, because they're so much more superior to the MiG-29s. They're designed from the bottom up to be invisible, almost invisible to radar, and they are the next generation, really. The MiG-29 is a decades-old technology, and so the very last thing Russia wants is for NATO to enter the fight, because that's like the next generation technology that they don't really have. They only have 12 planes, and they don't want to lose any of them, because it's all they've got. And the F-35s, then it'd be really very hard for the Russians to attack them. So the F-35s would be really quite safe, because they can take out anti-aircraft missile systems from the air. So the very last thing that Russia would want is for NATO to get involved. Once they've cleared the skies, which wouldn't take them long, over Ukraine, and after that, they would be all the Russian troops on the ground would be completely vulnerable to NATO air superiority. So all the artillery is not much use once these enter the battle. So there's no way that Russia wants NATO to get involved. And then people look and say, well, look, the only thing that they've really got superiority on is about the nukes. Now, the only difference for the nukes is that Russia bluffs and NATO doesn't. Indeed, Trump has come out quite strongly on this. He says that if he was president, he would be bluffing back to Putin. And he would be saying to Putin, my button is bigger than yours, just like he did for Kim Jong-un. But Biden isn't like that. So that's the only difference between, and thank goodness, I think, my personal view, I don't think it would be a more stable situation with both sides bluffing. I think it's bad enough to have Putin bluffing. But whatever you think of that matter, some Trump enthusiasts will say, the United States should be bluffing back, and that would make it all stronger, and then Putin would back down. But anyway, whatever the situation is, that it's just Putin is bluffing, but both sides have the same number of nukes. Indeed, the NATO has 2005 nukes to 1,625 for Russia, if you count the ones that are actually deployed. So the deployed ones are ones that they could use within a few hours to days. It depends how quickly, if they can get them ready, so they can use them within minutes. If they go to a high alert level, which Russia hasn't done. But they also have thousands of nukes that are in storage that are not counted for a new start because they're not part of their arsenal, not part of their official arsenal. They're in storage, they're being decommissioned in one way or another, they're just not officially counted. So if you include all those, then Russia have more of those that they are getting rid of than the United States has. But if you count the ones that are actually deployed, the ones they can actually use sort of seriously and without an awful lot of work to get them back into condition again, then United States and NATO, 2005 is including NATO. That's why there's so many more, because it includes countries like France and United Kingdom. France has the most nukes in Europe. So, and that's why there's so many more for NATO. And so then there's this idea of a first strike. People say, yes, but okay, what Russia could do is they could do a big first strike and they could destroy the NATO capability to strike back, but that's not true at all. Indeed, most of you will know that they couldn't destroy NATO's capability to fight back. And I think most of you know that. That's the mad thing. But except NATO wouldn't respond like that today. They respond very differently, at least the United States would. So really, so it's the same both ways. Let's look at Russia first. So suppose NATO wanted to destroy the Russian nukes. It's got more nukes than Russia. On paper, you'd think, well, that they would just need to fire one nuke to every Russian nuke and they destroy them all. But it doesn't quite work like that, because the NATO, first of all, Russia would shoot down many of the ICBMs. It's the same the other way around if Russia attacks NATO. So Russia has less nukes than NATO. It'd be very difficult for it to destroy them all, and then NATO would shoot down 2/3 of them probably. But then the other thing is the subs and the stealth bombers. So NATO has lots of stealth aircraft and stealth bombers, and the ones invisible to radar, and then the submarines, they are totally invisible because they're under the sea, and radar doesn't go into the sea. So all you've got is sonar, but sonar is very short range. So the Russians, they can't see we can't see the Russian subs either. The Russians can send their subs all the way around into the Baltic, and we can't see them. Although they usually surface, we know they're going into the Baltic, but if they're beneath the sea, then we can't see them. There's nothing we can do that can see them, and you can't use sonar because subs are we can't use acoustic detection because nuclear subs are very, very quiet. They're designed to be quiet, and they can travel silently through the sea at great speed. They're very fast and silent, and invisible to radar, and invisible to sonar unless you're very, very close. I mean, look at MH370 and how difficult it is to try to find MH370. Unless you're practically on top of it, you're not going to see it. And it's the same with the nuclear subs, and even more so because they're designed to be hidden. And the nuclear subs are very silent. You can't pick them up with acoustic detection. So there's just no way that the United States could destroy all the Russian subs. And the other way around, there's no way that the Russians can destroy all the nuclear subs. There's the United Kingdom has one, France always has two that are at sea at any one time. United Kingdom is unusual that our only deterrent are the subs. We haven't got land, sea and air. We haven't got any air mounted nuclear weapons. We only have we've only got them deployed from our nuclear subs. So, but the nuclear subs, then they can fire a nuke from anywhere in the world. An ICBM can hit, so a Russian ICBM or a UK ICBM, and then the lots. So there's 3 from NATO, and then there's quite a lot of them. I don't know how many that are always at sea from the United States. 3 from Europe, and then lots from the United States of these nuclear subs that are always at sea, impossible for the Russians to hit. And each of them has got a lot of nukes. I'm not sure how many on each sub. So it's just impossible, and they can't destroy. There's also this myth that somehow. So if I go back up here, and then And this is well, that's with the bluff with the. So Russia already has nukes in Kaliningrad, and it has the nukes for the nuclear subs. So when they start threatening with their nukes, they're not actually doing anything different. And indeed, Russia's been threatening with its nukes for at least since at least since towards the beginning of this century. It's been threatening with its nukes and trying to get its way by just bluffing. But there's no way that Russia's going to use those nukes because it can't destroy ours. And so, if they wanted to do a first strike, it's just impossible for them to eliminate our nukes, and they can't eliminate our conventional forces either. So you get people saying, especially with that ICBM, so the recent ICBM of the Russian, the only thing different about that one is called Satan II by NATO for some reason, but it's just a big ICBM that puts lots of the nukes on one ICBM instead of having lots of ICBMs to fire the same number of nukes. It really makes no difference to Russia's nuclear capability whatsoever. And it's just a different way of doing it. And they claim that with that one thing that they can destroy all of our kingdom. That's absolute nonsense. They could turn into a radioactive wasteland. There's another thing about a tsunami that allegedly they could create a radioactive tsunami over Ireland. This is fantasy weapons. It's not true. It's not real. It's something from Star Trek. They just try bluffing with whatever they've got, even though it's even going beyond what's actually factually possible. And in reality, if Russia was to attack the United Kingdom with nukes, even if they fired all their nukes at the United Kingdom, our conventional forces would remain, our subs would remain. We'd have command. We've got command centre below Whitehall, which is protected even against nuclear weapons. We've got lots of conventional forces spread out throughout the world. There's just no way that they could eliminate the United Kingdom as a threat to Russia by using nukes, even if they used all their nukes just on the United Kingdom. And there's no way that the Russians could then come in with the Russian army or something and somehow take over the United Kingdom. Indeed, their Russian army is proven to be very, very incompetent. It's just amazing people always thought that they were perhaps the second strongest army in the world. Now there's a joke that they're the second strongest army in Ukraine, but there really is an awful lot of truth to that. That the Ukrainian army, equipped with the NATO weapons, is stronger than the Russian army in Ukraine. The only thing that Russia is stronger with is its nukes, but it can't use those in the Ukrainian army I'm talking about, not stronger than NATO. The only way that Russia is stronger than the Ukrainian army really is with its nukes. Apart from that, it's a weaker army than NATO, than Ukraine. They haven't even managed air supremacy. People don't really know why that is. But they're just very timid and scared of getting their planes shot down by the Stingers and so on. And they have run out of the Russian army. They have run out of most of their best weapons. They had only one hypersonic missile they fired in the entire war. They proved that this new missile does exist by firing it, but apparently don't have many of them, or they're very, very, very expensive. They don't seem to want to risk a second one. One was their limit. They have almost run out of their cruise missiles and smart bombs, to the extent that the Russian pilots, they are now dropping dumb bombs that can't navigate once they leave the jet fighter. The jet fighter drops the bomb and they try to get it on its right trajectory. It's extremely difficult to hit, say, a bridge or a railway line or a road with a bomb that you can't change the direction. The Allies found that in World War II. It took lots of bombs to be sure of destroying a bridge, say. So the Russia are in that situation now, and they obviously have somewhat better capabilities than World War II. Of actually, they've got their satellites and they know where the things are that they have to hit, but they are having to use dumb bombs to try to hit them for a lot of their fighting, because they've run out of them, because they use over 2,000, and they can only make 20 of these things a year. They have much lower production capacity than the United States has, or than NATO has, for their smart weapons, and they've used them all up just about. So there is no way that this thoroughly incompetent army, the way they've conducted the attack on Donbass has been thoroughly incompetent, and on Kiev. Once they had to retreat, the retreat from Kiev was very incompetent. The Ukrainians, they pushed back a bit around Kiev. They only pushed back a few miles here and a few miles there. The Russians obviously decided, well, we've had it, because the Ukrainians had also been cutting their supply lines, and they'd been taking out their tanks, and they'd been destroying their battalions and so on, and the Russians had a really rough time trying to attack Kiev, trying just to surround it and try and do a siege. And they obviously decided, oh, well, this is too much, we've got to retreat. Well, that's fair enough, but they didn't do an orderly retreat. They did an orderly retreat from the big city close to the Belarus border, but when it came to the soldiers that were near Kiev, they had to rush out as fast as they possibly could, and many of them couldn't make it, because the Ukrainians did a big pincer movement that cut off hundreds of square kilometers around Kiev, and all the Russian soldiers in there, then they had no chance of escaping, and eventually they were all mopped up. They were all captured or killed. So it was a thoroughly incompetent retreat from the Battle of Kiev, and then they thoroughly incompetent the way they're conducting the operations in Donbass. They haven't given their soldiers enough time to recuperate. The battalions are very damaged. A lot of their men have died. The soldiers are very low morale. They don't have much trust in each other. They don't have much trust in their commanders. And then they're stuck together with another group of people, not to make up the numbers, under a commander they've never served under before. A battalion has to learn to work as a unit over a period of time. And even the conscripts, they'd had several months of working as a unit, and many of these were conscripts that were told they weren't going to be sent into battle anyway, and now they're fighting in Donbass. It's no wonder that the Ukraine is finding it very easy to stop them. They haven't managed to achieve they've got 22,000 soldiers in Izium, which is the point they took as their key vantage point to try and push their way in and try and surround the Ukrainian soldiers, and they haven't managed to make hardly any progress there. And just today we hear that Russia is fighting back, that Ukraine is pushing back in Izium, and they've been pushing back around Kharkiv for a long time, for several days now, and the Russians decided just a bit too late that this matters, because it's going to cut off their supply lines, and they don't seem to have realised, as one joking commentator put on Twitter, that he could see it while his daughter was watching Peg of the Pig on TV, and he could just see from following the public information that the Russians were soon going to be in trouble because of the way they were just letting the Ukrainians advance around Kharkiv. And they're getting in trouble. They've realised they've got to try and recapture. They're not managing it. They haven't got enough soldiers because they need to keep the soldiers in Donbass. They likely are going to be cut off quite a bit more. They've got attacks on their supply lines in Belgorod from the Ukrainians, which are firing now long-range missiles. They've been sent these very long-range howitzers, which are they can fire shells with a great deal of precision for a very long distance. A couple of days ago, the Ukrainians used these long-range howitzers to attack the command post for Izium, and they did that just after the most highest-ranked general of the entire Russian army and close confidant of Putin was there to observe the progress in Izium. My personal thought, I think it's quite possible that they deliberately waited until he'd left. That it'd be better to attack after he left, so he could see how incompetent the Russian soldiers were, and it wouldn't have been very good if they'd actually killed him. It wouldn't have really achieved very much. It would have been a big shock, but it wouldn't have been, in any case, whatever, they didn't kill him. They probably could have, or if not, if the timing had been slightly different, they would have killed him. But they did kill another general, and they killed many top officers during that attack on the command post in Izium. And after that, for several days, the advance from Izium stopped, and now the Ukrainians are pushing back there. And they've also, probably today, they have, you probably know that they destroyed the most, the very best of the Russian warships in the Black Sea, the flagship, which was very important because it was used to protect the other ships. That was its main function. It had got very, very advanced protection against missiles. It should have been able to shoot down the Neptune missiles that the Ukrainians apparently used to destroy it, and this shows extreme incompetence of whoever was commanding the Moskva, and they must have got lazy and thought, there's no way the Ukraine's are going to hit us, and maybe their system just weren't activated or something. Because it's very hard to see how, if all their systems were functioning properly, how the Ukrainians could have sunk them, and maybe they switched them off for some reason. It's hard to understand how it happened in the middle of a war. It's very, very difficult to understand how the Ukrainians were able to take down this ship. But it was sunk, and it's at the bottom of the Black Sea now. And then the Ukrainians, and this leaves the rest of the Russian ships but much less defended, because it was this one that was defending the rest of them. And the Russians have two others of those, but they can't get them into the Black Sea because the only way to get them in is through the Bosphorus, and Turkey isn't letting them in. So they have one in the Mediterranean, I think, or somewhere quite close, but they are not. Turkey isn't letting it in. They've got no protection for their ships. They've got much less protection. They have some protection, but much less. And the Ukrainians they shot down a couple of ships down, smaller ships down a couple of days ago. They shot probably about the second best of the ships in the Baltic Sea. They seem to have sunk it today, although that needs to be confirmed. There are multiple reports saying that they have sunk probably the second best of the ships in the Baltic Sea, of the Baltic fleet today. So this thoroughly incompetent invasion, it's extraordinary how bad it is. This Lithuanian deputy defense minister called them blundering barbarians, and it's very difficult to understand why they are so incompetent, why they're so bad at what they do. And another example is that the generals speak on the clear to their soldiers. They have no encryption for they just talk on the radio or the walkie-talkie to their soldiers at the front line. They say, watch out, I'm coming to give you an inspection at 5 o'clock today. And Ukrainians listen and they hear them say that. Incredible. And the reason is they had this state-of-the-art encryption service, which was, and that's probably partly why they have lost 12 generals out of the 20 they originally committed. I think that's the latest count. Because generals just say to their soldiers, we're on our way, basically, and the Ukrainians know, and then they kill them. That basically seems to be what's going on. And it's very hard to understand why they're so incompetent, because they surely have trained for years to do this sort of thing. And they had all these exercises. They've been exercising. They exercised last year, just outside of Ukraine. They exercised this year for months. And then they went in, and it turned out they're totally unprepared. This is what they were exercising for. They just don't seem to have learned anything. They don't seem to have learned anything from the Battle of Kiev. And this is something that military analysts have noticed before, that they are very slow learners for some reason. They have a very top-down thing, way of organising. It's like the commanders at the top give almost no initiative to the commanders at the ground level. Whereas with NATO and with Ukraine has learned it from NATO, they have it the other way around, that the commanders at the ground level can do surprise manoeuvres. They can say, oh, we can see this way to do this right now, and they just go ahead and do it. And the Russians aren't permitted to do that. They've got to pass it all the way up to the commander and say, look, we can see how to capture this outpost, and then the commander say right down to them, well, okay, after viewing what we said and thinking of it, yes, go ahead. And all that time, is wasted. And that's why, and we have the Russian generals, they keep on having to go to the front lines to see for themselves. And part of the reason why the generals are constantly having to see for themselves what's at the front lines is because they don't allow the commanders on the field, the lower level officers, to make these decisions for themselves. The generals have to go and look for themselves on the ground and see, well, what is it that you're facing? Why is it that you're not managing to advance here? And what are the opportunities? And then they say, okay, you can do that, and then they go away again, then they've got to come back again. So this is the top-down nature of the Russian, and this is not something, they probably are aware of these problems, well, for sure they are, but the problem is it's ingrained and endemic, and they can't fix this quickly. It's going to take years and years of learning the lessons of the Ukraine war before they can fix this. The Ukrainians were like the Russians in 2014, but since then, they've all that time since then, they've learned to be much more agile, and they've learned the NATO methods. And so that's why the Ukrainian is working. It proves that the methods used by NATO are far superior to the methods used by Russia, which haven't changed since the USSR. They're ancient USSR methods of conducting battles, whereas NATO is far more modern, agile, different ways of fighting. And that's part of the reason why they're winning. It's not just better weapons, but it's better forms of strategy. So with the point in all that is that there's no way that Russia, and they use 65% of the ground forces of Russia were committed to Ukraine. And that includes a significant part of each of the major units, the regiments and the brigades. Each of those has lost a significant amount in the Ukrainian war. A significant amount from every one. Very unusually, they didn't just send one of them in or several of them in, they sent a few from all of them. So now if you go and look back, and if you look for instance at Finland, then this is not an army that's any threat to Finland. And as the Lithuanian, the bumbling barbarians, as the Lithuanian Deputy Foreign Minister said. And it's been extraordinary how they've used, like their long-distance precision weapons, they used for attacking civilian targets, which is not only barbaric, and they're trying to intimidate by fear, but it's a complete waste of these things in terms of military. Served absolutely no military purpose. They've used up 2,000 of them, and most of those are not serving any military purpose, and now they haven't got any left. It's really, really, really strange, and military historians are going to be puzzling over this for centuries, I imagine, as to why the Russians were so incompetent in the battle for the Ukrainian battles. And so this is not an army in its current state, so they probably will learn from this. But in its current state, the Russian army is not an army that is in any way up to the task of invading, say, Finland, or invading Lithuania, or invading Sweden. They just can't do it. And they would have to retreat all the soldiers from Ukraine, and they're absolutely battered after all this. They must be absolutely, and an awful lot of them just don't want to fight. They surrender very easily. They get captured very easily. A lot of them are conscripts now. They are so short of soldiers. They have rounded up people from Donetsk. In the Donetsk and Luhansk Republic, men who have good jobs are scared of going out on the street because the conscriptors, it's very much like the time of the press gangs. Back in the old days in the United Kingdom, they used to have press gang they used to press gang sailors into the navy. So people just be they get these press gangs, that's the name of them, gangs of people who went around and they captured people, captured men, young fit men, and took them off into the navy. And that, so it's very much like that with the Russians in Donetsk and Luhansk, and they're trying to press, and they're probably going to start doing that in other parts of Ukraine. They're trying to use Ukrainian soldiers to fight against Ukrainians. They're just cannon fodder. They don't really want to fight. They equip them with ancient equipment like helmets from the Soviet era, and they're so short on equipment. They're using equipment from the Soviet era, and tires. For instance, there were some tires that were from 30 years ago that they spotted on one of the missiles that was captured, one of the armored vehicles that was captured. They looked at the tanks, and the tires that are on those tanks are 30 years old. 30 years old technology. They were made, it says on them USSR, and then in English, made for made by the USSR, and it was probably made for India, but they never delivered them to India. So these are some tires that they're having to use because they've run out of modern tires. So using ancient tires from 30 years ago for some of their armored vehicles. And and it's full of cracks, and a lot of their tires sort of, if they drive off the road onto rough ground, and the tires tend to sort of fall a bit. They stop working, and the things just get bogged down, partly because of the muddy conditions, but partly also because they get flats on all their tires. So that's been another theme all the way through. And then you get people, you got Ukrainian farmers pulling out the tanks with their tractors. The tanks don't have tires, but the tanks run out of fuel and they sink into the mud and so on. And then the armoured vehicles and some very advanced equipment, they abandon them and so on. So this army is not a threat for NATO. So they're not going to do a first strike because they can't stop NATO's capability to fight back, and there's no way they could follow through on a first strike. There's no way they're going to invade a country by using nukes first in any way or anything like that. And they are struggling in, I've already talked about tactical nukes separately in my thing about tactical nukes, that there's no point in them using them. They've got no real military value in Ukraine either. So I hope this helps you understand. And this is why NATO, as the war has progressed, it's become clearer and clearer how incompetent Russia is, how very weak they are, and that what they say about nukes are just bluffs and bluffs. And Putin tried to seem strong, but NATO knows that they're incredibly weak, and they know that Ukraine is going to win. NATO are certain that Ukraine is going to win this war, and so that is the background. So when you get here, NATO with all these bluffs, not NATO, Ukraine with all these nuclear bluffs. You get NATO, and they don't bluff back, although they're much more powerful. They don't need to bluff. They know that Russia knows they're much more powerful. So they're the big powerful ones, and Russia's it's like these little animals that sort of make themselves look very big because they're scared. And that's basically what Putin is doing. He's like a little animal puffing himself up and saying, you try and attack me, and I'm going to attack you with nukes. And NATO knows they're not going to. So the main thing these bluffs are doing now, they're not intimidating NATO at all. So Russia bluffs and it says, if you sanction us, we'll use nukes. If you send tanks to Ukraine, we'll use nukes. If you send anti-missile weapons to Ukraine, we'll use nukes. If you send advanced howitzers to Ukraine, we'll use nukes. And they just keep on saying that. Well, they don't say it explicitly. They haven't actually used the word nukes hardly at all, Russia. They just said, things as fast as lightning, or things such as you've never seen before. You get a response such as you've never seen before, and things like that. These vague threats, which vaguely suggest nukes, although in reality, then military doctrine wouldn't permit use of nukes in any of these circumstances. And it's exceedingly unlikely that anyone there seriously considered nukes for any of this. So That's why they tend to use these rather vague words. And so NATO they don't see any evidence that they actually are deploying their nukes. They're getting them ready so they can be used quickly. There's no sign that they're making their nukes ready to be used quickly or moving them around in ways that suggest they're going to actually use them. And Russia doesn't want to really raise the nuclear alert level because it's scared of NATO. So it wants to publicly bluff in order to scare the public of NATO, but they don't want to give the impression to NATO that they are ready to use the nukes, because then because they're scared of NATO. So Russia's basically scared, but it's trying to bluff, and it's trying to be the big one, and basically I think a lot of these bluffs are intended at the general public, in the hope that the general public in NATO will cause some restraint on their leaders, that their leaders won't want to use sanctions, won't want to send the planes to Ukraine. That's one remaining thing. They make 29 planes. They've helped repair them, but they haven't actually sent them new ones. And that the general public in NATO will be intimidated by their bluffs. And so I think that when you get scared by the Russian bluffs, an awful lot of it may well be that they're intimidating the general public rather than intimidating the leaders. NATO don't see any evidence of anything. So when you see you get the impression, you might get the impression, and this is because of the journalists, not because the politicians don't say that, but the clickbait journalists give the impression that NATO is playing chicken, and that NATO is just pushing Russia, and they're as far as they can go. They're just saying, how far can we push them, and without them responding with nukes. But that's not what NATO is doing at all. NATO has excellent intelligence, and it's really amazing how much they know. But just to give an idea of how good their intelligence are, they have spy satellites. You've probably heard of about the Hubble Space Telescope. Well, the US, I can't remember one aspect of one part of the US defense, they had a couple of spare spy satellites that they didn't need, and they offered them to NASA. They said, do you have any use for 2 spare spy satellites? Could you use them for astronomical reasons? And they are going to use them. One's going to go up, I think, quite soon, and then another one a bit later. And these 2 spare satellites, they have mirrors that are the same size as the Hubble Space Telescope mirror. So that was offered a couple of decades ago. They made that offer a decade or so ago. No, maybe it was I can't remember, 2012, was it a decade or maybe 2 decades? I can't remember if it was a decade or 2 decades ago that they offered their second-hand spy satellites as well, once they didn't need to send into orbit. So the United States has lots of spy satellites in orbit that are at least as powerful as the Hubble Space Telescope, but they are pointed at Earth. And instead of looking at stars and galaxies and so on, so presumably if they turn these things around and point them at the sky, but I don't know if they're able to focus at the far distance like that. But if they could, and we could have done a dozen Hubble Space Telescopes, but it takes an awful lot more to turn into a proper, well done functioning telescope. As you can see from the number of years it's taken NASA to convert these spy satellites into astronomical instruments. But they are, so they have these things. They aren't actually very useful for astronomy because they're designed for looking at the Earth from really quite close, comparatively, maybe 500 kilometers. And they're just not designed to look at distant stars and planets and things. But they have the same size mirrors as the Hubble Space Telescope, and according to one calculation, if you look at the resolution, they should be able to resolve things 5 inches across from orbit. And maybe less than that with computer processing. They would have to they would probably use adaptive optics to untwinkle, because because it just like stars twinkle, then you have this similar kind of effect if you try and look at the ground from orbit. So they would probably have methods by which they untwinkle the, as it were, the details on the ground. And then using that, they'd manage maybe 5 inches, maybe less than that, maybe 2.5 inches resolution. So they can't actually literally read your number plate, as some people say, but they probably can't do that. But they would be able to see that your car has a number plate and tell it apart from a car that doesn't have a number plate from orbit. So they have very good intelligence from orbit, and they can so they couldn't recognize individual people by their faces or anything like that from orbit, and they couldn't read your number plate. That seems unlikely. I think that's kind of beyond incredible, but they have very high resolution images from orbit, and then they have the very good cyber capabilities which they use, which they probably have very good. The Russians have shown them to be actually quite incompetent at cyber attacks. So it might be that they just haven't been able to do anything to the Ukrainian electricity, for instance, throughout the entire war, except by direct attacks on the power stations. Even in a country that's under war, it had a little bit of beefing up of its security with the help of NATO, but it hasn't got the same level of security as a NATO country. And Russia just hasn't been able to do anything about taking down, for instance, elements of the Ukrainian electrical grid or anything significant. They haven't done anything significant of a cyber nature during the entire war. A little bit of what's the word called? Denial of service attacks on some websites. That's about it. That's all they seem to be able to manage. So, the United States may well have much better capability on that than Russia does. So again, it seems that Russia was overestimated on that, and their cyber capabilities may not be as high as the United States had thought it was. And but the United States seem to have very impressive intelligence about Russia, and they seem to have some knowledge of what is being discussed in the inner circles in Russia. And it's not clear whether this is cyber intelligence, because they knew about the invasion long before Ukraine did. They only knew the day before. But Biden was warning about it before the Winter Olympics. He was warning that Russia was preparing to invade Ukraine, that they would invade. He said that they considered invading during the Winter Olympics. And everybody says, no, that can't make sense. Doesn't make sense. They just, but it turned out that the United States intelligence was spot on, and they knew about the invasion long before anyone else did. So the United States has very good intelligence, even in a circle, in even things that the commanders on the field commanding the soldiers, many of them probably didn't know these things that NATO knew long before the invasion. And so NATO has very high level of either spying. It may have very high level, may have very good methods of cyber spying, and it may have leaks from malls and from just dissatisfied people around Putin, who doesn't like what he's doing and wants it to fail. So there may be things like that going on as well. So for whatever reason, the United States is not acting, it's not playing chicken. It's not acting and saying, it has very good knowledge and understanding of the Russian capabilities, of what Russia is doing, and they all the details, they can see everything with great detail. They have these spy telescopes, they have the cyber capabilities, they have and so this, when Biden, we get the impression from this war that he is very, very careful as a president. And so Trump says he's too cautious. That's his criticism. He doesn't say he's overcautious. And So everyone agrees that Biden is being very, very careful in this war, and NATO generally is. So when they start doing these things like sending howitzers to Ukraine, the reason is because they've decided that Russia is showing itself to be so weak, and that these things are just bluffs, and they're not to be taken seriously at all, and not to be taken seriously as a very careful assessment, top grade, high level assessment of Russian, of what they're doing, what they say, and their capabilities. And so, and please don't get scared by all the clickbait stories from journalists, and some of them will know exactly what I've been saying here, but they just play it up in order to make a story. And then all the bluffs by Putin, it's all he's got left. He's got words. All he's got left is words. So he uses this nuke thing over and over again, implying it indirectly. Vague, threatening words that mean nothing. And NATO knows what Russia's true capabilities are. And they have these fancy weapons. They do have high technology. They have hypersonic missiles, but as I said, they only used one in the entire war. So that's one of these quips again, that Russia has a large, very well-equipped army, but the part that's very well-equipped isn't large, and the part that is large isn't very well-equipped. It's something like that. That's a quip that is passed about Russia. So it certainly had some very clever scientists in Russia, and engineers, and they devised some very powerful, very clever weapons, but they have hardly any of them. And part of that is the oligarchs. So Putin commissioned things through oligarchs, and they just cheated him, and they just took the money and then produced a few things, but they just didn't have very many of them, and they look impressive on the Red Square, but they're not the army that Putin sent into Ukraine. And it's likely that Putin still doesn't realize quite how bad his army is. He would give up. He would have sued for peace a month ago. He wouldn't have invaded. But if he'd realized, he would have sued for peace when he still had his soldiers around Kiev. He would have said, right, we're going to retreat now. We'll sue for peace. We'll come up with the best conditions we can. That was his high point in the entire war, when he controlled as much territory as he's ever going to control. It's not credible that he's going to control that much again, ever again in this war. And it doesn't seem likely that he's going to be able to dig in either. They've only left 2,000 soldiers looking after, taking in charge of Mariupol, because they're sending as many fighters as they can. A lot of them had to retreat to recoup, and any that are left are needed for the Donbass. So Mariupol is very vulnerable, and if Russia has a big defeat in Donbass and they lose lots of soldiers there, then their coastal strip is vulnerable. They might well lose Mariupol. So this is also why it's very unlikely that Putin makes a big thing on Victory Day, because he could lose quite quickly. So he needs to have his backstop prepared. So Putin surely will be thinking about all this and be saying, well, it could be, if he will have got more, he certainly has better intelligence now. And he probably realizes much of what I've been saying here, and which the West analysts have realized for a long time. But he's unlikely to really make big claims on Victory Day, and that's the messaging that's coming out of the Kremlin. It's going to be an ordinary day, and the special operation is continuing, and it's achieving all its objectives, but they don't need to say anything on Victory Day. And so it seems quite possible that they will actually wrap up kind of fairly soon. That is optimistic, but that is the reason that NATO has supplied such big offensive weapons to Ukraine, is because they think Ukraine can win quite quickly with some assistance. And that is the best way to peace, from NATO's point of view. Because if Russia captures some territory, then Russia will then say, well, we won so much by this war, we won a bit of Donbass or something, or we won Mariupol, we won the coastal strip, or Kherson or something. Then they will dig in, and they will try to settle for a frozen conflict rather than a proper peace treaty, and then they will attack again as soon as they recovered a bit and learned their lessons. So that is why NATO don't want to kind of give way to. And then there's the whole thing about war crimes, that in all the areas they don't seem to have conducted war crimes in Crimea or Eastern Donbass before the war in the same way that they have since the war. But in Mariupol and they basically conducted lots of war crimes, destroying all the civilian buildings. But during the attack in 2014, they attacked and captured Mariupol for a short while. They didn't conduct war crimes then in the same way. The Ukrainians had very little resilience back then, and the Russians took Mariupol very easily, but only for a short time. They didn't do that this time. So it's very different from the Crimea, where they took it very easily, and there was almost no violence there from the Russian side when they captured Crimea. But this, along the coastal strip from Crimea to Donbass, there's been just so much attacking and war crimes against the civilians. And like right now, even just right now, they are forcing civilians to clean up the streets in Mariupol using food. Instead of paying them, they're saying, you won't get any food unless you clean up the streets. And that's not the way to win the population over to you. So it's not likely, and if they're putting up Russian signs and they're forcing the locals to use rubles, not based on any sentiment of people locally. The people locally are being, even if they had sympathies towards Russia, they've lost it, and they're wanting to be part of Ukraine. So even in Kherson, even in Mariupol, in places where there could have been quite strong Russian support, but there isn't. So it's going to be almost impossible for Russia to keep control of these places long term, except by deporting everyone to concentration camps in Russia or something, which they're not going to do, or they have deported some million people or something. But it doesn't seem, surely they're going to put them in concentration camps literally, though some of them had pretty bad times and some of them being killed. The ones that they claim as being to do with the Azov battalion, they've killed. So as prisoners of war, at least there's reports of that. And badly hurt and some killed. I probably have to double check that, really. Sorry, maybe I should double check that before. But anyway, they have done, the situation is that there's just no way that Russia can actually keep control of the areas of Ukraine that it's captured, except possibly some areas in Luhansk, where they went forward and the locals were more receptive or something. But I think most of the areas that they've captured, then they're not going to be able to keep very easily at all. And Ukraine, so Ukraine is, they're not talking about retaking the Crimea. They're not going to do that, not militarily. But for a peace agreement, they will want Russia to retreat to the pre-invasion boundaries. So Putin, he knows that this is a risk, that he may have to do that. So he will probably preparing as a backstop that if this happens, that he will claim that he has denazified Ukraine and is now retreated, having successfully denazified Ukraine. So that's likely to be Russia's narrative. So if he makes any other statements in the Victory Day parades on May the 9th, then he will probably have to admit defeat later on. If he says that he's taken Mariupol, that Mariupol is now Russian, or if he says that the whole of Donbass is now part of Russia, or Kherson Oblast is now part of Russia, or anything like that, then he's going to risk defeat. And he has put the face of being a very big, strong person in Russia. And so maybe some other Russian presidents could have got away with it, although quite difficult, but it's going to be very difficult for Putin to continue his regime if he's seen as having been defeated in a big way. So this is why it's really quite unlikely, though it's possible. We'll see what happens, but it seems quite unlikely, especially with Ukraine now doing a major counter-offensive and pushing back against Russia, and that probably will be what Ukraine is doing in the next few days. They're saying, for the next few days we're going to really start showing Russia that we're doing a counter-offense. So that seems to be what Ukraine's plan is. And the last thing they want is Russia to commit to a long war on May the 9th. And I don't think Russia will. So that seems to be the situation. So it's not a first strike, no risk of nukes, and Russia is, Putin is very unlikely to be, he may do more, I don't want to say, because there are people still saying that Putin will declare a longer war on May the 9th, and people saying that he will make various declarations, but most of the analysts, and so I have to be cautious, because before the whole invasion started, it was just, I was telling everyone that he's not going to invade, because I was based on what seemed to me to be the best sources. Now, based on what seemed to be the best sources, I don't think Putin is going to be declaring much on May the 9th, but I have to be cautious about that, because some people are still saying that he may declare a longer war. But when it comes to the first strike, and then that's NATO and United States. They had excellent intelligence, and they were talking about the invasion weeks before, right back to before the Winter Olympics, and they're saying there's no possibility of that. Everyone who's reasonably reputable is saying that there's no possibility of Russia using its nukes, and the United States haven't been increasing their, say there's been no need to increase their nuclear alert level. So I hope that helps some of you in NATO countries who to stop being scared. If you're not in NATO countries, it's not even relevant. There's no possibility of Russia attacking. And I hope you'll all be a bit less scared about the idea of a first strike. And I'm quite hopeful. I mean, the best of all would be if the war could just stop today. So all this fighting stop, all the attacks, all the killing. I mean, that would be best of all. But it doesn't seem very likely. But it does seem possible that Russia will be defeated. It probably will continue fighting until after May the 9th. But the way that Ukrainians are pushing back is looking very much like the Battle of Kiev all over again. And Russia is getting so depleted. I wouldn't be surprised if we see them moving towards a peace agreement sometime. But so far nobody is saying that with any great confidence yet. So I bet not say that with any confidence. It's a possibility that they might go to a peace agreement at some point in the not so distant future. They might try to dig down, but it's very hard to see Russia continuing as they're doing now for any great length of periods of time. So it looks like this war will have an end date, and then the question is, the main ways it could end. It could end with the continuing frozen conflict. That seems less and less likely, because Ukraine is so much more, it's proving to be much better than Russia, and it's difficult to have a frozen conflict when it's quite unequal like that. And then it could be, and so it doesn't seem likely now that the other possibility that Russia makes significant gains, and it doesn't seem likely that Russia could hold on to what it's got now either. That seems really looking less and less likely too. So the third possibility, that Russia retreats to the pre-invasion contact lines, it looks very much like that's what's going to happen, and that's what Russia and that's what NATO and Ukraine have been saying for some time now. For at least a week or two, they've been saying that Ukraine's going to win, and that Russia's going to be pushed back to pre-contact invasion lines. But they have said that it could take a long time. And so the worst case, Biden has budgeted for 6 months he's asking for a budget for 6 months for the Ukrainian military, and that would seem to be, and some people say it could go on for years, but they're talking there about a very low level of conflict like Crimea, like before this war, that could continue for years if there never is a peace treaty. But even then, it would be back to the previous contact lines, I think. And it's very hard to see Russia holding on to all the territory it has now for another 6 months. So that gives you an idea of timelines as it's shaping up over the last few days, where it's becoming clearer and clearer that Ukraine is much stronger than Russia now. Ukraine now says it's on the offensive, and it really seems to be significantly stronger than Russia now in Ukraine. So we'll see with the combination of better tactics and more soldiers. It's probably got more soldiers because it's got the same number as at the start. It's lost probably not as many as Russians, but it's had a big influx of 10,000 or more soldiers from other countries, expat Ukrainians, and also, like it had some from Israel even. It's had soldiers from all around the world come to Ukraine. Those have made up many of its losses. Russia hasn't had any big infusion of experienced soldiers. It just had its conscripts, and it hasn't been able to add any. It won't be able to add any for quite some time yet. So Russia's numbers are going down, whereas Ukraine's numbers are staying the same. According to we don't actually have figures for Ukraine, but at a rough estimate, if you look at the number of foreign fighters that have joined Ukraine, and then you assume that you take the rough estimates of how many soldiers Ukraine has lost, and it's surely lost less than Russia because of its better tactics. And when you add that all up, it seems that Ukraine probably has the same level of fighting strength as it had on February 24, or possibly slightly better, whereas Ukraine has much less fighting strength. And as time goes on, Russia is getting less and less fighting strength. It's using up all its best weapons, and Ukraine is getting better and better weapons with the same fighting strength or better. Russia is having less availability to advanced weapons, and its fighting strength is going down as the war continues. So the progression where this is going, there just doesn't seem to be any way that Russia can recover from that. It's not now looking likely it's going to take on large-scale conscription. I think Putin realizes that that's not going to solve his problems in time, because it would be up to 6 months before he gets significant new recruits, because he's got to train the trainers. It took a year before the United States had a significant increase in its recruits in World War II after it started to join. So it was 6 months to actually start, because they had to train all the trainers first. So Russia is likely to take, that's why the 6 months has significance that Biden has budgeted for. By 6 months from now, if the Russians are still fighting, they may be able to have some more new recruits that have never fought them before come and join the battle. So basically, Ukraine looks set to win. I think most of this strategy, I can't find anyone apart from the Russians, but Russians doing propaganda saying that Ukraine isn't going to win eventually. And the best sources I see, the best analysts, the experts, admittedly they're generally all in NATO countries or Ukraine, but they have given good analysis all the way along, and they seem to be quite hard-headed. They don't seem to use propaganda and exaggeration in this war in the same way that the Russians do. So I think there's quite a high chance that we do get a peace treaty, basically once Putin realizes how bad his situation is. I don't think he's realised quite how bad it is yet. He's probably still getting fed a certain element of opium from his commanders. So anyway, so I hope I get less scared and then of nukes, and also help you to maybe, and be less scared of the Russian army, which is really these bumbling barbarians. It's very hard to understand why they're so bad, why they're so incompetent. But they seem to be, and I think military historians are going to be puzzling over this certainly for decades and probably for centuries, try to understand how Russia lost so badly, how it did so badly in the Ukraine war. But there's no doubt it is. So that's the situation. It's a very weak force. It's really not threatening anyone now. It's apart from Ukraine, and it's probably, once it's defeated there, it's probably not going to be coming back again for a long time. It's going to take years to recover, and maybe it'll be a new regime. Maybe Putin will be deposed. Maybe he will resign in 2024. I don't think he's going to continue having the same level of support amongst his inner circle. He's lost the support of the what do you call them? The plutarchs. What are they called? The oligarchs, and he's lost the support of his spies, he hasn't lost the support of his spies. He's lost the support of the technocrats. He's only really got the spies left, so he's losing a lot of support himself. And he's probably had quite a lot of adverse comments from his generals too about what he's been doing in his choices during this war. Anyway, I've been talking about a lot. I'll upload this now, but hopefully this will help some of you.